The USS Vanguard glided silently through the cold endlessness of space. Its sleek, polished hull reflected the surrounding stars, a symbol of humanity's recent rise among the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. On the bridge, Captain Ethan Marlowe stood before the large viewport, his sharp eyes fixed on the endless abyss before him. His fingers lightly brushed against the cool surface of the console, though his mind was far from the peaceful view of the stars. There was a restlessness in him, a sense of unease that had been growing ever since humanity had begun to explore the greater reaches of space. Peace had come to Earth, at least for a time, but the quiet of the cosmos, far beyond the familiar orbit of their home world, felt increasingly fragile. The galaxy was full of wonders, yes, but also dangers, some beyond human comprehension. It was only a matter of time before something, or someone, would test that fragile peace. He never expected it to come so soon. The soft chime of the intercom interrupted his thoughts. "Captain, we're receiving a priority distress signal from Orixis." It was Commander Drake, his second in command. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, the kind that only came when something serious was unfolding. Orixis. The name stirred something in Marlowe. The Voro-Cal, the peaceful alien race who had first made contact with humanity just a few years ago, hailed from that lush, green world. Orixis was one of Earth's first true allies in the galaxy, its people known for their wisdom and tranquility. The alliance had been a hopeful sign, a promise of peaceful coexistence among the stars. To hear that their world was in danger was unthinkable. Marlowe walked toward the communications console, his mind racing. He pressed a button, and the image of Voral, the leader of the Voro-Cal, flickered to life on the screen. His pale pink face, framed by his luminous eyes, was set in a grim expression. "Captain Marlowe, this is Voral of the Voro-Cal. We are under attack. The Zarath have breached our defenses. Our cities are falling. We need your help. The energy weapon we developed, it's unstable. If we cannot stop them soon, Orixis will be lost." Marlowe's heart sank. The Zarath, a ruthless, war-driven species with a brutal history. They were known for their merciless invasions and their desire to conquer and subjugate. And now they were attacking Orixis, one of the most peaceful planets in the galaxy. The Voro-Cal had no military, no defense against such an onslaught. "We'll be there as quickly as we can," Marlowe replied, his voice tight. The image of Voral flickered again, his face more desperate now. "We cannot survive this alone, Captain. We are not warriors. We are scientists and philosophers. We are peacemakers. Please, help us." The transmission ended abruptly. Marlowe turned to Commander Drake, who had been listening in. His expression was hard, his gaze focused. "The Zarath are merciless. If we engage, this could escalate into something much bigger. We're talking about a full-scale war." "I know," Marlowe said quietly, his mind already processing the possibilities. "But we can't ignore them. Not now." He took a breath, steadying himself. He had seen the horrors of war from afar, but this was different. This wasn't just a matter of military might. It was a moral imperative. The Voro-Cal had trusted humanity, and now Earth's first true allies were in need. There was no turning back. Set a course for Orixis. Maximum speed. The ship's engines hummed to life as the Vanguard changed course, its sleek form accelerating toward the distant planets. As they neared Orixis, the once beautiful green world appeared before them, now scorched by the fire of war. The atmosphere shimmered with the haze of destruction, and in the distance, massive Zarath warships circled like vultures, raining down destruction upon the planet's cities. On the bridge, the crew of the Vanguard watched in stunned silence as the scope of the attack became clear. The Zarath were not simply invading. They were intent on exterminating the Voro-Cal, wiping out their culture, their civilization. The peaceful world of Orixis was on the brink of annihilation. "There's no time to waste," Marlowe said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We need to make contact with their military command. We'll help them regroup and organize a counterattack." "Captain," Drake said, his tone cautious, "the Vorokal don't have a military. They're not soldiers." Marlowe turned to face him, his expression firm. "I know, but they are survivors, and we will teach them to become warriors if we have to." As the Vanguard entered Orixis's atmosphere, it was clear the Vorokal were already overwhelmed. The once vibrant cities had been reduced to rubble, their delicate architecture destroyed by the relentless bombardment from the Zarath fleet above. In the distance, the Vorokal civilian population was scattered, many of them fleeing into the wilderness, unsure of where to go or who to trust. On the ground, the Vorokal Command Center was a dimly lit facility located deep underground, far from the chaos of the surface. Vorel, looking exhausted but resolute, met with Captain Marlowe via hologram, his pink skin ghostly pale beneath the flickering lights. "Captain Marlowe, thank you for coming," Vorel said, his voice heavy with gratitude. "But time is running out. Our cities are lost. We need to stop the Zarath before they reach the heart of Orixis, before we lose everything." "Tell me about this weapon," Marlowe said, his mind racing. He knew the stakes. A weapon capable of turning the tide could be their only hope, but it came with risks. Vorel hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "It's an energy transference device. We designed it to share power across vast distances, to help planets like ours exchange resources and energy. But it was never meant to be a weapon. The core is unstable. If we fire it at the Zarath fleet, there's a chance it could tear apart the very fabric of space. We could lose everything." Marlowe paused, considering the implications. The decision was not easy. Firing such a weapon could cost them more than just Orixis. It could tear apart the galaxy itself. But what choice did they have? The Zarath were already slaughtering the Vorokal with impunity. If they didn't act, Orixis would be destroyed, along with all their hope for peace. "We'll do it," he said at last, his voice firm. "We'll find a way to make the weapon work. We'll stop the Zarath." As the Vanguard made its descent to the surface, Marlowe and his crew prepared for the dangerous mission ahead of them. The Vorokal, though not trained in combat, had some of the brightest minds in the galaxy. With their knowledge and the advanced technology humanity had brought, they could make the weapon work. But only if they were able to reach the star core near the Zarath fleet's blockade. That was the only place where they could gather the power needed to charge the weapon. "Prepare yourselves," Marlowe told his crew. "This won't be easy, but we can do this together. For Orixis." And so, as the Vanguard landed on the war-torn planet, Captain Marlowe and his crew prepared to face the unknown. The stakes were higher than they had ever imagined, but they had no choice. The galaxy's future and Orixis's survival depended on them. The USS Vanguard settled into the atmosphere of Orixis, its sleek form cutting through the smoke-filled skies. The once beautiful planet now looked like a war-torn battleground, with jagged scars of fire and destruction marring its once green surface. As Marlowe stood at the helm, he felt the weight of what was at stake pressing down on him. The Vorokal were counting on them. Their cities were in ruins, their culture on the verge of extinction, and their once proud people scattered throughout the wilderness. Time was running out. Marlowe turned to his crew, their faces tight with determination. "Commander Drake, you're with me on the surface. I need you to organize the Vorokal civilians and get them to safety. We'll find the weapon's activation site." Drake nodded, his expression resolute. "Understood. We're running low on supplies down there, Captain. It's a mess, but I'll get them to safety." "Keep communication open," Marlowe said. If anything goes wrong, we need to know. As the Vanguard touched down in the heart of a ruined city, the distant sounds of the Zarath assault echoed through the air. The shrill hum of their plasma cannons, the roar of their warships overhead. The battle for Oryxis was far from over. Marlowe's stomach tightened. The coming hours would test them all. The cityscape was unrecognizable. What had once been an elegant blend of natural and architectural beauty was now a labyrinth of crumbling structures, twisted metal, and shattered glass. The air was thick with the stench of burning debris. Amid the chaos, groups of Vorokal civilians fled in every direction, their faces masks of fear and desperation. Marlowe and his team, now outfitted in heavy exosuits for protection, moved swiftly through the streets. The towering shapes of the Zarath war machines loomed in the distance, their jagged obsidian forms standing as ominous silhouettes against the fiery sky. Marlowe's communicator buzzed. It was Commander Drake. "Captain, we've got a problem. The Vorokal are panicking. They don't know where to go. They're scattering everywhere." "Get them to the underground bunkers," Marlowe ordered. "There's no time to waste. We'll secure the weapon. You make sure no one is left behind." Drake's voice came back, more urgent. "Understood, but we've got incoming. Zarath dropships are heading our way." Marlowe's jaw tightened. The Zarath weren't wasting any time. They were closing in, determined to wipe out Oryxis in one fell swoop. He couldn't afford to let the Vorokal scatter. If they didn't hold the line, this mission would be over before it even began. "Marlowe out." He turned to his team. "We need to buy them some time. Move." The Vorokal had hidden their most powerful asset, the unstable energy weapon, deep within the planet's core facility, a massive underground complex built into the side of a dormant volcano. The facility was the heart of Oryxis's energy grid, but now it was all that stood between the Zarath and the destruction of the planet. Marlowe and his team navigated the facility's dark, echoing corridors. The hum of the weapon's core could be felt in the air, vibrating through the floor beneath their boots. "This is it," Marlowe said, his voice steady. He didn't allow himself to be distracted by the fear, the knowledge of how unstable this entire situation was. "We activate this weapon, and we'll have one shot at stopping the Zarath. There's no turning back." "What's our plan?" asked Lieutenant Yara, a weapons specialist, as she scanned the control panel. "We'll sync the weapon with the star core. The energy transfer should be powerful enough to disable the Zarath fleet," Marlowe explained. "But we need to be quick. If we stay here too long, the weapon will overload." The team moved to workstations, connecting cables and activating holographic interfaces. The air crackled with tension. Outside, the sound of Zarath war machines closing in grew louder. Marlowe's fingers flew over the controls, his mind sharp and focused. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If they failed, the weapon would tear Oryxis apart. If they succeeded, they would only have one shot to stop the Zarath. The countdown began. "We have 5 minutes," Yara said, her voice taut. "This could go critical any second." "Keep it steady," Marlowe ordered. "We need more time." Meanwhile, Commander Drake and his team worked tirelessly to corral the fleeing Vorokal civilians into the underground bunkers. But the Zarath were relentless. Their dropships were descending, sending squads of soldiers to the surface. Heavy infantry, their armor nearly impenetrable, marched through the ruins, firing energy blasts at anything that moved. Drake's pulse quickened as he saw the first dropships land nearby. There was no time to waste. "Move! Move!" he shouted, waving civilians into the bunker entrance. He turned to one of his soldiers. "Get the secondary hatch open. We need to double-time this." As the last of the Vorokal civilians began to file into the bunker, Drake heard the screeching roar of a Zarath war machine, a massive armored creature, its 6 legs stomping as it moved toward the civilians' position. "Everyone, get inside now," Drake ordered. raising his blaster. He opened fire, his shots sparking off the war machine's armored hull. But it was no use. The beast turned toward him, a massive weapon mounted on its back. He dove behind a pillar just as the first blast tore through the air, exploding a nearby building into dust. Meanwhile, inside the facility, Marlowe's team worked frantically. The weapon's core was pulsing with unfiltered energy, the air thick with power. The countdown clock was ticking down, only 2 minutes remaining. "Almost there," Yara said, sweat beading on her forehead. "We just need to channel the power into the core. The stabilization fields will hold, hopefully." Marlowe watched the readouts, his hands steady despite the rush of adrenaline. "We can do this," he whispered to himself. But then the ground trembled beneath them, and the sound of explosions shook the walls. "Drake," Marlowe called into the comm, his voice urgent. "How much longer?" "I'm buying you time," Drake's voice crackled back through the comms. "Get that weapon online now." Drake was still fighting, still holding the line. The Vorokal civilians were in the safety of the bunkers, but he knew it wouldn't last. The Zarath were closing in fast, and the weapon was the only hope, not only for Oryxis, but for all of them. "Hold on, Captain," Drake muttered, his pulse hammering in his ears. 10 seconds, Yara called, her voice rising with urgency. Marlowe's eyes darted to the countdown timer. They were almost there. 5, 4. The ground shook with an explosion that rattled the entire facility. Marlowe gripped the console as the power surged, and then, with a deafening hum, the energy core came to life. "Now!" Marlowe shouted. "Fire!" The sky above Oryxis erupted in a blaze of light as the weapon fired, a beam of raw energy that tore through the atmosphere. It shot upward, arcing toward the Zarath fleet. The power of the weapon was immense, lighting up the sky with the force of 1,000 stars. The Zarath warships, caught off guard by the sudden energy burst, were struck by the force of the beam. One by one, their shields flickered, then collapsed. Their ships spiraled out of control, crashing into the atmosphere or exploding in a shower of debris. The battle for Oryxis was not over, but the tide had turned. The Zarath fleet was crippled. The blast from the weapon was visible even from space. For a brief moment, Marlowe and his team stood in the energy core facility, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow. The weapon had been fired, but whether it had worked, or whether they had just triggered a disaster, was still unknown. Marlowe stood frozen, watching the unfolding chaos on the monitors. His heart raced in his chest, and his mind spun with thoughts of what might come next. Had they done the right thing? Was this victory, or had they just made the situation even worse? "The energy pulse is affecting the Zarath fleet's entire formation," Yara said, her voice tight. She worked furiously at her console, watching the data pour in. "Their ships are destabilizing, Captain. Shields are down. But, wait, something's not right." Marlowe's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "It's the weapon's feedback. The energy spike is causing irregularities in the fabric of the planet's core. The weapon's burst is interacting with the gravitational field of Oryxis itself." "What does that mean?" Marlowe asked. "It's hard to explain," Yara said, her brow furrowing. "But this isn't just a simple energy release. The pulse has begun destabilizing the planet's own energy grid. The core is overloading. We might have triggered something far worse than we thought." Marlowe's stomach dropped. They had fired the weapon to save Oryxis, but now it seemed that Oryxis itself might be in danger. The battle between the Vanguard crew and the Zarath was far from over, but the massive burst of energy had thrown the invaders into disarray. Their ships were spiraling, many disintegrating into ash, their systems failing from the weapon's feedback. It was a brief moment of hope, but it quickly turned to dread. Back on the surface, Commander Drake was leading the Vorokal civilians deeper into the underground bunkers. He heard the ground rumble beneath his feet, followed by a deep tremor that rattled the walls. He stopped, his hand against a column, as a strange, low hum filled the air. The tremors grew more intense, and a sense of dread washed over him. "What the hell is that?" Drake muttered, glancing around at the panicked Vorokal. He keyed his calm. "Captain, we've got another problem. The ground's shaking. Something's happening under us. It's not just the Zarath anymore." Marlowe's voice crackled back, laced with concern. "I know. Yara says the energy pulse is triggering something in the planet's core. We're looking at the possibility of a planet-wide catastrophe. If we don't fix it, Oryxis could collapse." Drake's face hardened. "How much time do we have?" There was a pause on the comms. "Not much." Drake's eyes swept over the frightened faces of the Vorokal civilians. Their survival was still uncertain. They had escaped the Zarath's assault, but now they faced an even more terrifying enemy, the planet itself. Back in the energy core facility, the team was scrambling to understand the full scope of the disaster they had unwittingly triggered. Marlowe's mind raced through possible solutions. Yara was right. They had fired the weapon in desperation, thinking it would save Oryxis, but instead they had set off a chain reaction that now threatened to tear the planet apart. "We need to shut down the weapon," Yara said urgently. "If we can cut off the power feeding into the core, we might be able to stabilize it before it's too late." "Can we even do that?" Marlowe asked, already anticipating the problem. "There's an emergency shutdown protocol," Yara said, tapping commands into the terminal. "But it's complicated. We'll need to access the central reactor controls in the facility's sublevels. The farther we go down, the more unstable it gets. The core's feedback is intensifying. We'll have to move quickly." Marlowe clenched his jaw. "Then let's move." They had no choice. Time was running out. The team descended deeper into the facility, the hum of the unstable core growing louder with each step. The walls were beginning to tremble, and the faint vibrations underfoot became more pronounced. The air was thick with static electricity, as if the entire structure was alive and thrumming with barely contained energy. "We're getting closer," Yara said, voice shaking slightly from the tension. She led the way, the emergency lights flickering above them. "The core's feedback is causing severe energy distortion. It's a miracle the facility's still standing." "Let's just get to the control room," Marlowe replied, his voice sharp and focused. But as they neared the final access panel, they heard it, a loud, shrill whine that echoed through the halls. The entire facility shook violently. "We're out of time," Marlowe muttered. "It's now or never." They burst into the control room, and Marlowe immediately moved to the central console, where the emergency shutdown override was waiting. His hands flew over the keys, but the system was glitching, feedback and static distorting the screen. He had to act fast. "Come on," he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. A sudden burst of light filled the room, and the ground buckled beneath their feet as another violent tremor hit. The emergency lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. "What the hell was that?" Yara gasped, stumbling in the dark. "The planet's destabilizing," Marlowe said grimly, his voice calm despite the panic setting in. "We have seconds to shut it down before the core erupts." Then the screen flickered back to life, and a warning flashed across the terminal. "Warning. Core destabilization in progress. Immediate shutdown required." Marlowe's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment of truth. He entered the final override command. Above, in the sky, the remnants of the Zarath fleet began to plummet toward the planet, their ships disabled and crashing in fiery heaps. But in the distance, a new threat was emerging, Oryxis itself. The core's energy fluctuations had begun to twist the fabric of reality, distorting the planet's magnetic field. The collapse was imminent. The console screen blinked one last time. Shutdown complete. The hum of the facility's core began to subside, and the tremors slowly ceased. The atmosphere of imminent collapse began to fade, though the damage was done. They had stopped the core from fully destabilizing, but Oryxis would never be the same. There was too much damage. Marlowe let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "We did it," he said quietly, though his voice held no joy. They had stopped the worst, but there would still be consequences. Oryxis had been saved from total destruction. But at what cost? On the surface, Commander Drake and the Voro-Cal civilians were still recovering from the aftershocks, but the immediate danger from the Zarath was over. The last of the invaders had been dealt with, and those that had survived were retreating. The battle was won, but the victory felt hollow. Drake stood at the edge of the city, looking at the charred landscape around him. The ground still hummed with energy, and the sky above flickered with unstable radiation from the weapon. Oryxis had survived, but it was forever changed. The surface of Oryxis was still trembling with the residual energy of the planet's destabilized core, but the immediate threat from the Zarath had been quelled. The remnants of their warships were scattered across the skies, their weapons silent, their hulking forms smoking and crashing to the surface like fallen stars. The Voro-Cal, though battered and broken, had managed to find shelter in the underground bunkers. Commander Drake stood at the entrance of one of the bunkers, his eyes scanning the horizon, taking in the quiet aftermath. He was no stranger to war, but the devastation here had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The air smelled of scorched earth and sulfur. The jagged outlines of destroyed buildings rose up around him like skeletal remains of a civilization on the brink of extinction. Drake keyed his calm, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Captain, we're good here. The last of the civilians are safe. I'll begin organizing evacuation teams to get them to the temporary shelter stations." There was a long pause on the other end. "Good work, Commander. We've managed to shut down the weapon and stabilize the core for now, but the damage to the planet is irreversible. Oryxis isn't what it used to be." Drake looked down at the ground, watching the fissures in the cracked earth glow faintly with leftover energy from the core's unstable reaction. "Yeah, I've seen it. It's not just the surface that's scarred. The planet's core is damaged beyond repair. We've bought them time, but that's all we've done." Marlowe's voice crackled back through the calm, sounding grim. "We'll figure out a way to help them rebuild, Commander. But right now, we need to make sure the Zarath aren't planning a second wave. Stay vigilant. We'll be back up to assist soon." Drake exhaled, looking out over the ruined landscape. "Understood, Captain. Stay safe." As he turned to lead the remaining civilians to safer ground, his mind wandered back to the events that had brought them here. They had won. Yes, the Zarath had been defeated, and the immediate danger was over. But the cost of their success was enormous. The Voro-Cal had lost their cities, their infrastructure, and much of their culture. The planet would never be the same. Back aboard the USS Vanguard, Marlowe and his team were still reeling from the aftermath of the operation. The ship was in orbit above the planet, and the full scope of the damage was becoming clear. The weapon they had fired had saved the Voro-Cal from the Zarath invasion, but it had also caused irreparable harm to the planet's ecosystem. "Captain, we've got new readings," Lieutenant Jarrow, the Vanguard science officer, said, his voice tense. "The planet's core is still unstable. The feedback from the weapon's activation has triggered permanent shifts in both Oryxis tectonic and magnetic fields. The planet's entire ecosystem is collapsing." Marlowe looked up from the command chair, his expression hardening. "How long does it have?" Jarrow swallowed, clearly reluctant to give the news. "Oryxis has maybe a decade before its core becomes fully dormant. At that point, the planet will be rendered uninhabitable. The gravitational fields will collapse, and any life left will die." "And the Voro-Cal?" Marlowe pressed, his voice low. The best we can do is offer refuge on Earth, Jaro said, tapping away at his console. But that's a huge undertaking. We'd need to evacuate thousands of Vorokal, relocate them, and provide them with new settlements. It's going to be an overwhelming logistical effort, and we don't know how Earth's government will react to such a request. Marlowe closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of it all sinking in. They had saved Oryxis from the Zarath, but they hadn't saved the planet. Not really. And even if they helped the Vorokal resettle on Earth or elsewhere, they were still refugees. And Earth, with its own political and cultural tensions, might not be ready to take in an entire alien species, especially after the tensions surrounding the war. As the days passed, the Vanguard's crew continued to aid the Vorokal survivors, assisting them with food, medical supplies, and temporary shelter. But there was an undeniable pall of grief and uncertainty that hung over the population. The Vorokal were grateful for the help, but their world was lost. Their cities lay in ruins, their historical heritage destroyed, and the knowledge that Oryxis would soon become uninhabitable hung over them like a death sentence. Commander Drake was one of the few who remained on the surface, working directly with the Vorokal leaders. He was helping them understand what had happened, how the core's instability couldn't be fixed, and how their people could be saved. They had little time to prepare for the eventual exodus, and that meant hard choices. Drake walked through the refugee camp where Vorokal children played with what little they had, their laughter a stark contrast to the dark realities around them. He stopped at one of the camp's temporary shelters, where a Vorokal elder, Corin, stood waiting for him. Corin's gaze was far away, lost in thought. He turned slowly when he saw Drake approach. "We are grateful for what you have done," Corin said, his voice heavy with a mix of sorrow and respect. "But I can't help but feel there is more we should have done to prevent this." Drake shook his head. "You did everything you could. We didn't know the weapon would destabilize the planet. We didn't know it would be this bad." Corin's eyes locked with Drake's. "But now you know, and you've saved us from the Zarath. For that, we will always be indebted to you." Drake's gaze softened. "I only wish we had more time to help rebuild, to give you something more than just a future as refugees." Corin placed a hand on Drake's shoulder. "Do not think we have no future, Commander. We may not be able to save Oryxis, but we will survive, and in that we will honor the lives that have been lost and those who fought to save us." Back aboard the Vanguard, the crew worked tirelessly to arrange the logistics of the Vorokal exodus. It was a monumental effort, one that could strain all of humanity's resources. The political pressure from Earth's government was growing, with some factions calling for the Vorokal to be turned away, fearing what the sudden influx of alien refugees would mean for Earth's fragile ecosystem and society. Others, more sympathetic, pushed for Earth to extend a hand of aid, seeing the Vorokal as victims rather than invaders. Marlowe stared out the viewports at the distant, flickering glow of Oryxis. The planet they had fought so hard to save was slipping through their fingers. But he also knew that they had saved the Vorokal from extinction, and that was something, even if it wasn't enough. As the comms buzzed with updates from Earth's government, Marlowe felt a flicker of hope, fleeting and fragile. But there, nonetheless, there was still a chance to make a difference, to do something that mattered. "Captain," Yara said from her station, breaking him from his thoughts, "the Vorokal are ready to begin evacuation. We've got multiple fleets lined up for transport." Marlowe nodded, his face hardening with resolve. "Prepare the fleets. Let's get them out of here. We may not be able to save the planet, but we can give them some sort of a future." The first of the Vorokal ships, hastily retrofitted by the Vanguard's engineers, rose into the sky, taking the survivors from Oryxis to whatever uncertain future awaited them. More ships followed, each one carrying the weight of an entire civilization's hopes. Marlowe watched as the fleet ascended, knowing that this was just the beginning of a long journey. They had taken what they could, a victory over the Zarath, a chance for the Vorokal to survive. But it came at a price, and the true cost of the mission was still unfolding, not just for Oryxis, but for the future of humanity and the galaxy. The Vanguard and the fleet of Vorokal ships arrived at Earth's orbital station, the first stop in their long journey to find a new home. It had been months since the battle for Oryxis, and the Vorokal had settled into their new lives aboard the ships, waiting for permanent refuge on Earth. As the Vanguard glided into orbit, the station's sprawling structure gleamed under the light of the sun, a symbol of humanity's technological prowess. But despite the grandeur of the station and the mission's success, there was an uneasy atmosphere. The political situation on Earth had become increasingly volatile since the Vorokal's arrival. Marlowe stood, gazing at the distant planet below. His thoughts were far from the peaceful view. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. The Vorokal refugees had made it to Earth, but the political climate was volatile. The leaders of Earth's National Federation were divided on the issue. While some pushed for full integration, others argued that the Vorokal were too alien, too unpredictable to live alongside humanity. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see Admiral Reyes, the National Federation's liaison, stepping into the command center. Her expression was stern, her face drawn with the tension of the political discussions underway. "Captain," she began, her tone businesslike but with an undercurrent of worry, "we need to talk." Marlowe turned, his expression unreadable. "About the Vorokal?" Reyes nodded. "Yes, Earth's Council is pressuring us to act. They want a decision on the Vorokal's future here." Marlowe took a deep breath, looking back out at the planet. "We've saved their people, Admiral. That's the only thing that matters." "It's not that simple," Reyes replied, her voice tight. "The Federation wants to relocate them, put them on a remote planet or a space station somewhere. They're afraid of the consequences of full integration. The Vorokal are a highly advanced race, but they have their own culture, their own history. There's still too much fear about the Zarath War." Marlowe's jaw tightened. "And what do you think, Admiral?" Reyes hesitated. "I think it's a complicated issue. We've seen what the Vorokal can do, and they're not the enemy. Not anymore. But the political climate on Earth is hostile to the idea of an alien race integrating with us. There's resistance from the public. They're scared. They'll be even more scared if we abandon them," Marlowe said, his voice low and firm. Reyes looked at him for a long moment. "I know, Captain, but the Federation doesn't see it that way. And now you're going to have to take a stance." The National Federation Council was convening, and Marlowe had been called to testify. The chamber was filled with the hum of uneasy chatter as delegates from all corners of Earth argued about the Vorokal. Marlowe could sense the political tensions in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. He had seen the fear in the faces of Earth's leaders, fear of the unknown, fear of what an alien race might mean for their future. He sat at the witness table, surrounded by officials and representatives from the Federation's military and political sectors. Chancellor Ortega, the head of the Federation, sat at the center of the room, his steely gaze fixed on Marlowe. "Captain Marlowe," Ortega began, his voice cold and authoritative, "you and your crew have brought the Vorokal to Earth. While you may consider this a victory, I must remind you that there are consequences. Their presence here on our world creates a significant strain on both our resources and security." Marlowe leaned forward, meeting Ortega's gaze. "With all due respect, Chancellor, the Vorokal were our allies in the fight against the Zarath. They were victims of the invasion, and they've lost their home. They're not here to conquer us. They need refuge, nothing more. And we are to provide that refuge, Captain." "At what cost?" Ortega asked, his voice rising. The Vorokal have advanced technologies that could destabilize our own economy and military. Do you really think humanity is ready to accept an alien species that has the power to wipe out entire fleets with a single weapon? Marlowe's voice remained steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. The Vorokal are not the Zarath. They're not invaders. They are survivors. You don't have to fear them. You have to understand them. The room grew tense as the debate continued, voices clashing from all sides. Some Federation members argued that the Vorokal should be welcomed, given their help in the war. Others insisted that they were a threat to Earth's sovereignty. The situation was growing more polarized by the minute. Back aboard the Vanguard, Lieutenant Jaro and Yara were preparing for a new deployment, not to the front lines, but to assist with the Vorokal's relocation to temporary settlements outside the main cities on Earth. The Federation had approved the relocation, but the refugees were not welcome in the central regions. Political pressure was mounting, and there were protests against their presence. Yara worked silently at her console, typing in reports, but her mind was elsewhere. "I never imagined it would be like this," she said softly. "We saved them, but now it feels like we're just trying to put a bandage on a wound that won't heal." Jaro glanced up from his station. Sometimes the cost of doing the right thing is heavier than we expect. Yara sighed, her fingers brushing over the console. "I just keep thinking about what happened to Orixis. We couldn't save it. And now we're pushing the Vorokal into a world that doesn't want them. What kind of future are we giving them?" Jaro's voice was quiet but resolute. "The only future they have is the one we help them create." The Vorokal refugees were being moved into their new homes, isolated settlements far from Earth's major cities. The Federation had given them the bare minimum to survive, basic housing, supplies, but there was no effort to integrate them into society. No effort to build bridges, to make them feel welcome. Commander Drake stood with Corin, watching the refugees begin to settle into their new temporary homes. The mood was somber. "This is not the future we imagined," Drake said quietly. Corin nodded, his eyes scanning the camp. "It is the future we were given, Commander, but it is still a future. We will rebuild as we always have." Drake looked at Corin, seeing the weight of a people who had already endured so much. "Do you think they'll ever accept you?" "Our people." Corin paused before answering, a distant look in his eyes. "I do not know, but I know that we will survive, and we will never forget who helped us when we were most in need." Later, in the quiet of his quarters, Marlowe stood by the viewport, staring out into the void of space. The stars twinkled like distant hopes. He had saved the Vorokal, but in the process, had he lost something of his own? The political fallout, the distrust of the Vorokal, the uncertainty of what humanity would do next, it all felt overwhelming. His calm buzzed, and he answered. It was Admiral Reyes again. "Captain, I know this hasn't been easy, but you did what you thought was right, and you saved an entire species. Not many people can say that." Marlowe sighed, looking out into the stars. "I just hope it was enough. I hope we haven't created a future where we have to keep fighting for the Vorokal just to give them a place to live." Reyes's voice softened. "You did what you could, Marlowe. And sometimes that's all we can do. The rest, well, that's up to the future." Marlowe nodded, the burden still heavy but somehow a little lighter. He had done his part. Now it was time to let the galaxy decide what would come next. Months passed since the Vorokal had begun their uneasy resettlement on Earth. The temporary settlement zones had become a mix of quiet resilience and simmering unrest. The Federation had built them into isolated compounds, far from the bustling centers of human civilization, but not completely out of sight. There were protests, some peaceful, some violent, against the Vorokal presence. Some humans still saw them as threats, others as reminders of the Zarath War. Yet, amidst the chaos, something else was beginning to emerge, a fragile, tentative bridge of understanding. Commander Drake walked through one of the settlement zones, the dust of the earth beneath his boots and the weight of the past months in the lines of his face. His mission, his sacrifice, had left him exhausted, but he could still see a glimmer of hope. The Voro-Cal children, who had once played in the ruins of Oryxus, now laughed and ran through the makeshift streets of their new homes. They were adapting. The Voro-Cal were survivors. And survival, as he had learned, could breed strength. He approached a gathering of Voro-Cal elders, including Corin, who was deep in conversation with Earth officials. The elder nodded as Drake neared, his eyes filled with gratitude, but also a quiet sadness. "Commander, it is good to see you again," Corin said, his voice a deep rumble. "We have learned much here, but the road ahead is uncertain." Drake nodded, glancing around the settlement. "I've seen it. The fear is still there, but I think there's hope, too." Corin's gaze remained steady. "Hope is a fragile thing, Commander, but it is all we have." Drake's heart sank slightly as he realized how little he could truly do for these people. Earth's political climate remained divided, and while some had accepted the Voro-Cal, many others still treated them like outsiders. The Federation had started to allow more integration, human Voro-Cal collaborations in research, trade, and cultural exchange. But the path was slow, and the mistrust of both sides lingered. Tensions were reaching a boiling point on Earth. The Federation Council had convened yet again, and this time the stakes were higher than ever. Marlowe had been summoned to speak on behalf of the Voro-Cal, but he wasn't the only one testifying. Chancellor Ortega was present, his face drawn in a scowl, along with several other key members of the government. "Captain Marlowe," Ortega began, his tone colder than ever, "you stand before us, asking for Earth to extend full citizenship to an alien species. You are asking us to trust those whose culture and technology we know so little about. You are asking us to trust the Voro-Cal, whose very presence has become a political powder keg." Marlowe sat with his head high, despite the mounting pressure, knowing that this would be the turning point. "Chancellor," he said, his voice unwavering, "the Voro-Cal are not invaders. We owe it to them to give them a chance to live, a chance to build something, together alongside us. We cannot turn our backs on them now." Ortega's lip curled. "And if they decide they're too different, if their technology and their culture make them a threat to humanity. You are asking us to gamble with Earth's future, Captain." Marlowe's voice was steady, his eyes not leaving Ortega's. "I'm asking you to gamble on something greater. The idea that we can learn from one another, that we can build something better. The Voro-Cal are not perfect, and neither are we. But if we choose to fight over our differences, then we'll never find out what we can achieve together." For a moment, the room fell silent, as if the very weight of Marlowe's words hung in the air, an undeniable truth too heavy to ignore. Finally, the silence was broken by a quiet voice from the back of the room, Senator Thorne, a young member of the Federation who had been quietly listening. "I believe Captain Marlowe is right," he said, standing up. "The Voro-Cal may be different, but they are not enemies, and we, as a species, have never learned anything by staying isolated. If we are truly going to step into the future, then we must start by building that future together." His words were like a spark in dry grass. Slowly, others began to speak up, some in agreement, others still hesitant. The tide was shifting, but it would take time. Weeks later, after the vote had been cast, Marlowe sat alone in his quarters aboard the Vanguard. The decision had been made. The Voro-Cal would be granted provisional citizenship on Earth, with full rights to integrate into human society, though it would take years for them to fully be accepted. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless.